Thanks for your time.
Hi, David.
The US President called you 2 weeks before your state visit to Washington. What did he ask for?
Well, let's just start at the beginning. The US Attorney General undertaking an official investigation. Back in May, our ambassador made it very clear that Australia was prepared and willing to cooperate with that official investigation by the US Attorney. A couple of weeks ago, as you said, the President contacted me and asked for officially a point of contact between the Australian government and the US Attorney, which I was happy to do on the basis that it was something we'd already committed to do. And then we had a quick chat about looking forward to the meeting we were soon to have in Washington. So it was a fairly uneventful conversation.
So he was just after a point of contact in the Australian government?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we'd said we were prepared to assist and cooperate with that investigation, which is not unusual. I mean, the United States is a significant, in fact, our most significant ally, and we're used to sharing a lot of information. Now, Australia would never do anything in contrary to our national interest, but this was it would have been, I think, frankly, more surprising had we chosen not to cooperate, I think.
Did you find it unusual, though, that it required the US President to call the Australian Prime Minister to get a contact in the government somewhere?
Well, look, I've had many conversations with the President, and it was a very brief conversation, and it was not one that I'd characterise as being ladled with pressure. It was a fairly polite request for something that the Australian government had already made pretty clear that we were quite happy to do.
No pressure, you're saying?
No, of course not. No,
did he use the phrase favour?
No, not that I recall at all. No.
So he's just asking for someone that his Justice Department can contact?
Yes.
And has any other foreign leader ever asked anything like this of you before?
Well, I'm not aware of any other investigations that are being undertaken during my time as a Prime Minister where they might have occasion to do that.
So did this raise any concern for you that this is obviously an inquiry that's highly politically sensitive in the United States, that Australia might be getting sucked into some sort of partisan brawl in the US?
Well, no, I think that is the subject of media inquiry and speculation and commentary. That's that narrative. I mean, all that simply happened here was the US Attorney is undertaking an official investigation, and Australia had already stated in May that we would cooperate with such an investigation. And in a conversation I had with the President.
You know this investigation.
Well, that's a matter for the US.
Political.
That's a matter for US politics. That's not a matter for the Prime Minister of Australia. All I have to deal with is there has been a request from the President for us to do something we'd already undertaken to do.
And we automatically say yes,
and cooperate. Well, it would have been quite extraordinary for us to deny such cooperation. On what possible basis would we do that? We've got certainly nothing to hide. We're not the subject of this investigation, nor are we a party to it.
So what cooperation is Australia providing?
Well, our officials will engage with the US Attorney and,
to what end,
and respond as they consider appropriate.
So will we provide documents?
Well, again, Australia wouldn't do anything that would be in conflict with its national interest, and our officials are very experienced in these matters.
What does that mean? Will we provide diplomatic cables?
Well, that would be very unusual.
So we won't?
Well, it would be a very unusual thing to do, and Australia would never do anything that would prejudice our national interest.
Well, if it's very unusual.
So at the moment, it's quite a hypothetical question, though.
So we may provide the cables, or not?
I'm just saying that would be a very unusual thing to do. That would be very uncommon.
Has the US requested cables?
Not to my knowledge, no. But these are conversations that are being had between officials, David. I mean, these go to events that occurred well before the time I was Prime Minister.
Sure, but you're in charge now. Will they want access to Alexander Downer?
Well, we will cooperate with these sorts of requests, and you know, that is a matter for DFAT and those individuals to facilitate.
So that's a maybe?
Well, we're just going to work with the requests that come, David, and that's being dealt with at an officials level. I'm not sitting there providing, you know, an hour-by-hour clearance on every single request. I mean, our officials are quite capable of managing what are fairly, non-controversial matters.
Well, it is controversial with respect, Prime Minister, and I suspect many would expect that ministers and the Prime Minister may have some view on what information should be shared.
Well, no information should be shared that is contrary to Australia's national interest, and none will be.
will Australia and has Australia been asked to hold any sort of inquiry of its own into the events around Alexander Downer's meeting with George Papadopoulos?
No, and nor is it the subject of any such investigation. Australia's conduct here is not in question.
But has the US asked for that?
No, why would they?
So William Barr, the Attorney-General, didn't ask Australia to look into this further?
No, we'll cooperate with inquiries that he makes, and as again, in accordance with our interests.
But you're not aware he's asked already for that?
No, these are matters that are being dealt with by officials. At this stage,
okay.
there's been
as far as you're aware, there
have been no requests or no recommendations that have been made to me that have required my intervention.
I mean, cutting to the heart of this, what do you think went on in that meeting between Alexander Downer and George Papadopoulos?
I wasn't there. It was some time ago, and there's nothing to suggest that that has been put in the public domain that there is any matter for Alexander Downer to address. But and nor am I aware of anyone suggesting any inappropriate behaviour by him.
Sure, you've asked questions about this.
Well, it's not a matter that's the subject of an investigation, and nor it is one that I've been recommended to undertake an investigation into.
No, but I'm asking, do you think he did anything wrong? Anything?
Well, if that were the case, I'm quite certain that well before my time an investigation would have been undertaken, don't you think?
Well, you're the PM now, and it's Donald Trump who's looking for answers now.
Well, no, it's the Attorney General, the US Attorney General, who's conducting his official inquiry.
But the President's raising it with you.
Well, he just asked to us to follow through on a commitment that we'd already made, frankly, and we're facilitating that. I mean, there's been a lot of breathless commentary about this, but the facts are quite simple when it comes to Australia. He's undertaking an investigation. The United States is a close ally of Australia. We'd already undertaken to provide cooperation. The President, in a fairly brief phone call, followed up on this, and we're engaging with that inquiry.
And you don't think it's strange that he had to follow up on this when we'd already offered that assistance?
It's a matter for him, but my response could only be the one that it was. And again, what other possible response would Australia have provided to any president or any Attorney General?
We're not withholding anything the US wants?
Well, again, the engagement is being had at officials level, and there is nothing that has come to me that would warrant any clearance of information being provided at my level.
And are these foreign affairs officials, or are they?
They're Australian government officials.
Home affairs?
Well, I'm not going to go into which ones they are.
Look, just for the record, George Papadopoulos has said Alexander Downer was a fool, he was a spy, he says Downer recorded their meeting, there's a transcript. Is that right?
Oh, well, it's all very salacious commentary about a meeting which I'm sure whips up people's interests, but I'm not going to add to his own breathless commentary on these issues.
There's no recording of
I think I'll leave the hyperventilation on these matters to others who are far better equipped to practice it.
You're not aware of a recording, though?
So these are not matters, frankly, during my time as Prime Minister, that have been recommended to me as requiring any close attention.
But there's no recording of the conversation as far as you're aware?
Well, David, that's not information that I have available to me, and I'll tell you why. Because it's not a matter that has ever been raised with me proactively as being a matter that has demanded the attention of the Prime Minister. What has demanded the attention of the Prime Minister is the drought, has been the economy, has been our international engagement in the Indo-Pacific. These are the things that the President and I actually do talk about.
A final one on this. Labor has queried whether there was a special favour asked of Donald Trump, and 2 weeks later you get a special reception at the White House. In other words, were you played by the President?
Look, it's disappointing that Mr Shorten and Mr Albanese have gone down this path. I think it shows signs of unresolved bitterness on Mr Shorten's part. I think it's a bit disappointing, and I think the fact that Australia has a good relationship with the United States is not something that should be, I think, denigrated in the way they've sought to do that. I think that's been a fairly opportunistic and frankly, immature response.
Let me turn to some of these other issues. In fact, just picking up on your meeting with Donald Trump and others in Washington, did anyone ask about this President, anyone else, when you're in Washington about this whole issue?
No, and I was asked that at the time. And
no one raised it? Okay.
No, it was a matter that had already been
in the Oval Office, media's there. Donald Trump raised a whole bunch of issues. One of them was returning foreign fighters. He took a shot at the Europeans in particular. But can I ask for Australia's part? We have something like 60 women and children in refugee camps in northern Syria, and I think it's around 15 men in prisons, Kurdish-run prisons. Given the concern on the American side about this, it's not just the President, the Defence Secretary's called the situation untenable. I think the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff says these refugee camps are like a petri dish for terrorism. Can we just leave them there, or do we have a responsibility?
Well, it wasn't a matter that was raised specifically with Australia in terms of our own citizens that may be there, but our response to this is a careful one. We have a regime, thankfully now in place, that we're able to have legislated for temporary exclusion orders, which are designed to protect Australians and to protect our national interests. And they will be applied based on an assessment of each and every individual case. Secondly, I'm not going to put one Australian in harm's way to facilitate people's return. We have already facilitated some returns of young children, orphans, who are in many respects victims of this terrible process.
But are these refugee camps breeding grounds for terrorism?
Well, there are some quite hideous things that are occurring in these camps, and there's some pretty hideous people in them who don't want to do Australia any favours, I can tell you that.
Bring them back and control them, detain them, whatever you need to do.
David, you're making assumptions about the security of Australians who might have to be put in harm's way to facilitate that process. And I'm not putting one Australian at risk for that.
Too dangerous to go in there.
It's way too dangerous. Now, we work with our humanitarian partners where we have been able to facilitate, particularly young children who have been caught up in all this. But let's not assume that the individuals, particularly obviously the adults who are involved here, don't present any potential threat to Australia. That would be a big mistake to make.
Okay. A couple of other things. You were asked about Pastor Brian Houston while you were there. Did you suggest he be put on the guest list for the White House dinner?
David, the White House decides who comes to these events. And
but I'm asking if you suggested
that's who comes to it. And frankly, I've noticed, again, the commentary on this, and I've noticed the rather aggressive statements that have been made about Pastor Brian Houston and his wife. I've found that all a very unfortunate incident, and particularly for those who are very upset about some issues that occurred many years ago as well. And so I don't see any profit.
But it's a straightforward question, whether you suggested his name for this dinner.
No, I don't think it's helpful, David. I mean, there's one unpublished source comment coming out of allegedly out of... Well, I don't feel the need to comment on those things, David. I really don't. You know, if people want to put their... Because, David, I'm not going to go into the habit of just because one journalist somewhere in the world talks to someone who won't put their name to it, and all of a sudden, apparently, we've got to play 20 questions. That's just not how I'm going to operate. Okay. If people have an established source who's prepared to put their names to things, well, that's a different matter.
All right. You're giving a speech tomorrow night to the Lowy Institute on Foreign Policy. China, can I ask you about this? It's a relationship, obviously, that you're trying to balance right now.
True.
You did describe China as a newly developed economy while you're in the United States. China says we're about 30 years away from being developed. Why do you think China's wrong?
They're the second biggest economy in the world, David. They have the capacity now, as they've just put on display, to launch hypersonic weapons. They've had the biggest...
What did you make of that?
Well, this was not a great surprise for those who'd be aware of these things.
Scary.
But they have a significant capability, and there's no denying that, and they're certainly not denying it. They're putting it on display. They've just celebrated their 70th anniversary.
Is that flexing muscles, you know?
Well, it's not uncommon for nations when they celebrate the anniversaries to demonstrate what their capabilities are. It was not the first time we've seen that before. But I think it just actually goes to my point. I mean, they have had the most rapid expansion of their economy of any nation state in certainly our time, and arguably, I'd probably say unarguably, of all time.
So that parade shows they are developed.
They are the second biggest economy in the world. They are investing in the infrastructure and services of nations all around the world. They are a big, developed nation with enormous economic resources. And what's the demonstration of that? Their ability to invest those resources in all of those programs. Now, I'm not denying them their choices to do that. I just think it is just an expression that the world has got to a point where, after many years of engagement within China, and the point was to engage with China so their economy would grow and it would lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, which I think is China's greatest achievement. Now, that has occurred. That's great. But that has implications now for the strategic balance that sits within the Indo-Pacific region, within the global economy, how the rules are applied now. I mean, should Australian companies seeking to innovate in the technology field have the same rules that apply to them that apply to Chinese firms operating out of Shanghai? Now, of course they should. That's not a criticism of China. That's actually an acknowledgement of China's success.
Final one. Interest rates cut yesterday to a new record low. The banks haven't passed on the full cut.
Yeah.
Is that justified?
They never learn. They honestly never learn. And it's disappointing. You know, I suspect we're both mortgage holders, and like all other mortgage holders, they have a reason to be disappointed in the banks basically profiteering from that decision. Well, of course they are. I mean, their profits will be greater because of it. I mean, how else do you describe it? I've never been one, whether as Treasurer or Prime Minister, to give the banks a leave pass when they fail to do these things.
They say it's for depositors that they can't do it. Or for
no, I'm sure it is. Yeah, I'm sure it is.
You don't, Brian?
No, I don't. And I never have.
Anything you can do
they'll put their explanations out there, and the public will judge them based on what they say. But I'm not buying it.
Prime Minister, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dave.